From your favorite source for Chicago White Sox talk, delivering news, interviews, analysis, and more. This is the Sox Machine podcast with your hosts, Jim Margulis and Josh Nelson.
Thanks, Rob, and welcome to a new Sox Machine podcast. I'm your host, Josh Nelson, as we are recording this episode late on Sunday night, January 15, 2023. For many of those listening on Monday, it is Martin Luther King Day, and many of us will be having the day off from our 9 to 5s. So if you're listening at home while enjoying the day off, thank you for listening to this episode. I know there's a lot that's happening in the sports world, especially with the NFL playoffs kicking off. Good job, Brock Purdy, as the 49ers, who I like to root for, advance in the NFC playoffs, and also got some surprises. So it's been a pretty exciting week of football, but there's been some news for baseball and the Chicago White Sox front, as the Chicago White Sox have hired a new member to their front office to help rejuvenate the offense. We'll talk about that. The White Sox this past Sunday signed some international prospects, including Juan Uribe Jr. More about the White Sox international efforts will be covered in the Future Sox podcast, which will be released later this week with Mike Rankin and James Fox. So definitely check out that podcast episode as they break down all of the activity the White Sox made this weekend so far with the international signings and maybe some additional moves that they can make on that front. But we're going to start with this podcast episode as I introduce Jim Margulis, the managing editor of SoxMachine.com, to the show. The White Sox finally resolved the arbitration salaries of the players that were eligible for arbitration. And Jim, the one thing that I'm always fascinated with, especially with the offseason plan project, when we get these numbers and projections, we lean very heavily on MLB trade rumors. And when looking at the overall numbers, I have to say for this year, MLB trade rumors was pretty close for the White Sox players.
Yeah, $100,000 off, which is really good when you're talking about, 10, 12 plus million dollars. There were 8 arbitration-eligible players at one point. The White Sox non-tendered Danny Mendick and Adam Engel, and they outrighted Kyle Crick, so it rounded it down to 5. So, that on one hand maybe makes it a bit easier. On the other hand, makes it a bit harder. All it takes is one bad projection to alter it. So all of them were in the neighborhood. So yeah, it's a very valuable tool that MLB Trade Rumors has. I think it was Matt Swartz who his formula that they have tweaked over the years, and it's been very useful for, maybe you don't, maybe one projection is like $700,000 off, but usually for the sum, if you're just trying to estimate like what the White Sox payroll is going to be and how much of the payroll is occupied by arbitration or eligible players, usually does a good job for the sum as a whole.
And breaking it down, the list for those White Sox players that have settled with the Chicago White Sox, starting with Dylan Cease. This is his first year into arbitration, and we're going to talk about Cease a little bit more as far as his future earnings, because with him reaching his first year arbitration, he actually beat his projection. MLB Trade Rumors projected a $5.4 million salary, which is pretty high for a first year arbitration starting pitcher. Cease actually got $5.7 million. Ronaldo Lopez, his projection was $3 million for this season. He actually got $3.625 million. So Lopez and Cease beat their projections. Lucas Giolitio in his final year of arbitration and team control of the Chicago White Sox, his projected total was $10.7 million. He settles for $10.4 million, avoiding all of the drama that we had last year between the two differences and the very little sum that both parties were threatening to go to arbitration for until Jerry Reinsdorf had to settle that and call Lucas Giolitio and get that all sorted out. But when it comes to Cease and Lopez, before we get to the rest of the list, Jim, they're the only ones that beat their projected total. Are you surprised that they're the only ones that beat their projected total?
Not really, just because usually there's I guess you call them winners and losers versus their projections. Like it tends to wash out. So, if we're talking about like close to $1 million, rounding up to like $1 million difference. That's, I think, when it becomes noticeable one way or the other. But in this case, they're all, rounding down, $300,000 or less. Aside from Lopez is the one who shot over, and actually he was 3.3 million. So even then, that was 0.325 million. So all of them were pretty reasonably within their window of rounding down versus rounding up to 1 million.
And then continuing down the list, Michael Kopech, his projected total was about 2.2 million for MLB trade rumors. He settles for 2.05 million. I'm always curious on how they get to, you're going to make $2,050,000. Like, how did you get to that $50,000 mark? I don't know. Maybe it was really rigorous negotiation from Michael Kopech's camp, as he actually just exchanged as far as agencies. He transferred his representation to the same agency that represents Lance Lynn and Sebi Zavala. And then Jose Ruiz, his projected total was around $1 million. He settles for $925,000. We'll get to that in a moment. So the total arbitration salaries for the Chicago White Sox from the ARB-eligible players for the 2023 season is just $22.7 million. What I would like to discuss after the arbitration salaries, and again, it goes back to Dylan Cease here, Jim, making $5.7 million in arbitration one. And that is a lot of money. And it's got the gears turning for me. If this is what he's making in ARB 1, what is he going to make in ARB 2 next year? If he turns in another season where he's a top 3 Cy Young candidate, and if he continues this rate, what is he going to possibly make in his final year of control with the Chicago White Sox? So what I did is I was going through and trying to find the best examples, because oftentimes players and the representatives, they use other players as examples as a basis of their negotiation. And I thought that I found an easy one, because Cease finished in second place in the American League Cy Young. Well, Atlanta's left-handed starter Max Fried finished second in the NL Cy Young. So I wanted to compare as Fried is entering his arbitration 3 season. And for the last couple of years, starting in 2021, in his first year arbitration, Max Fried made $3.5 million. Last year, during the 2022 season, Max Fried made $6.85 million. So between ARB 1 and ARB 2, Fried received a 196% increase in salary. And then going to 2023, Fried is one of these players that there's a gap between the ball club and the representation. Not as big as the gap as Kyle Tucker and Bo Bichette. I think those guys have the difference between what they want and the ball clubs are offering is more than $2 million. Here, Fried's camp wants $15 million for the 2023 season. The Atlanta Braves countered with $13.5 million. So it looks like the Atlanta Braves and Max Fried are going to go to arbitration. The Braves are offering a 197% increase from ARB 2 to ARB 3. Fried's camp wants a 219% increase from ARB 2 to ARB 3. And there is one more year of team control for the Atlanta Braves of Max Fried, as he'll enter arbitration 4 next year. As he entered arbitration earlier, as the Braves called him up and started to use Max Fried earlier. So when I compare the Fried to Dylan Cease, so Fried's in ARB 3 right now because he's 29 years old. Dylan Cease is 27 years old, and he's entering arbitration 1, which was the same age that Max Fried entered arbitration, Jim. So already, Cease is $2.2 million ahead of Max Fried when it comes to arbitration earnings. And if I'm doing the math here, let's say if Cease pitches as well as he did this in 2022 and 2023, and let's say he gets a 196% increase in salary from ARB 1 to ARB 2, like Fried did, then we're talking about next year that Dylan Cease could have an $11 million salary, which is still pretty cheap for the elite pitcher that he has become for the Chicago White Sox. And if he continues that going to ARB 3, I'm guessing that he could maybe make more than $21 million in arbitration salary. Like, are the White Sox sweating here with these types of numbers of what Dylan Cease could possibly make in arbitration?
Well, just to clarify one thing, when it comes to increases, right now Fried was making nearly 100% increase year over year. So increase would be 100% versus like 200% or near 200%. So that would be truly scary. So, I mean, like, it's it's a thing I have to check as well when it comes to writing, just making sure that I'm representing the percentages right. Especially once you break 100%, it becomes like kind of odd, because I imagine very few of us have gotten 100% raises in a job, so it's very unusual. And we're thinking about 3 or 4% is a good year for annual raise. But when it comes to Cease here, for somebody on his trajectory, typically, like, somebody who you think is going to be, in a Cy Young race, or at least getting some nods and all-star appearances seem like they could be likely for his profile. Like, I more or less just count on him doubling his salary. And we saw that a little bit with Lucas Giolito. And then he kind of hit a wall. But he went from like 4.15 million to 7.45 million. And like, if he had like another huge year, where he was like another top 10 Cy Young finish, we'd probably be talking about like a $13 to $14 million salary. That's kind of how I'd bank it for his final year of arbitration. Like, basically what Fried is, asking for now in Arb 3. Like, I think they're pretty close, which makes sense because they're Harvard Westlake teammates. So I don't know if they're comparing notes when they're going into negotiations, but followed the same trajectory. But then, like, Giolito kind of hit a wall last year and was more or less a pedestrian pitcher. So he's now just broached 10 million and barely at that, which is still good, but not what he was imagining, when he turned down the 4-year, $50 million extension that was reported by James Fegan. So, that's kind of how I think about it math wise. It's just like the 100% nice round number, doubling his salary, nice and easy to figure. And I imagine for the White Sox, going into future projections for their payroll, and they're going to shed Yasmani Grandal after the year. Lance Lynn might not be there. How much of their salary is going to be taken up by somebody like Dylan Cease? And for like somebody like Cease, if they count on him being like the new number one starter, that's probably going to be like a doubling the salary. And for him, I think the fascinating part, like, is if they ever went to arbitration, and I would say that's rare just because, the White Sox seldom do. There was that one weird year with Avi Garcia and Yolmer Sanchez, where they both went to trial and they both won. And then Giolito kind of threatened it last year, but that was a little bit weird with the lockout shortening the negotiation period. There is a case where, like, very slim chance he might, but just assume that he won't. The fact that he's led the league in walks a couple times, like, when they use very traditional numbers when it comes to establishing arbitration amounts and similarities, who are similar pitchers in an ARB 2 year, ARB 3 year, age year, et cetera. And Cese's led the league in a negative category twice in a row. I think that would be an interesting thing to hear. Like, if you could be a fly on the wall of like the arbitration hearing, to hear like how much the White Sox hammer him with that. But just because they've been able to freely agree on previous deals, you just assume they keep doing it. And so that's ultimately a good thing for the White Sox, because the arbitration hearings can get very messy.
And as Jim pointed out, I am an idiot. It's 96% increase for Fried from ARB 1 to ARB 2. 97% is what the Braves are offering for his ARB 2 to ARB 3. Fried wants double, so that would be 119%. I'm an idiot. I apologize for all those that are good at finance that you've been screaming at me. I apologize.
And you're welcome.
And I think you're right, Jim. Thank you, Jim. Thank you for correcting me. I think that's sound thinking for your interpretation of what Cease could possibly make. It is fascinating just how this is going to balloon up. And again, he's represented by Scott Boras. So it brings into the conversation that we often get, or the question that we receive when we do off-season plan projects or people are looking into the future, that it would make a lot of sense that the Chicago White Sox could keep an elite starting pitcher like Dylan Cease. You spent a lot of time since you acquired him from the Chicago Cubs. And even though the White Sox didn't draft Dylan Cease, Jim, they did a lot of player development with Dylan Cease. I mean, when he joined the White Sox, he was in Winston-Salem. Mm-hmm. So he spent quite a bit of time in Winston-Salem and Birmingham and Charlotte. And obviously he went through some growing pains in 2020 where he's showing elite stuff, but he's not getting a lot of strikeouts, and he made some progress, I should say, in 2021. And then obviously it all comes to fruition, and he has a terrific 2022 campaign, and he's got, I'm sure with Justin Verlander now going to the New York Mets, Dylan Cease might be a preseason favorite to win the American League Cy Young by a lot of national outlets coming into this season. Doubling the salary, getting to $11 million, getting to $21 million, let's say. His agent, Scott Boras, has got to love that. And Boras' clients, he encourages them to go through the arbitration process, because instead of signing contract extensions or signing deals that wipes away the arbitration years, Jim, because it helps Boras with his negotiations that if Cease can get up to $21 million, that's the baseline when he enters free agency after his age 29 season, where I'm sure he'll be very coveted in the free agency market and he'll make a lot of cash. And Boras will know that it will be at least $21 million because the system says that my client is worth at least that much.
Yeah, and when we've talked about other White Sox starters, Lucas Giolito, Carlos Rodon, when we've discussed potential extensions, what it would look like for them, as long as the pitcher stays healthy, generally speaking, they can beat whatever value they get for an extension. Might take him a couple of years. Like in the case of Rodon, like he had to take a hit in his last year of arbitration eligibility, getting non-tendered, signing for $3 million, taking a step back, but then one big step forward in his first free agent year with the Giants. And now a huge contract that the White Sox wouldn't have been able to, or wouldn't have been willing to offer him in extension mode, with the Yankees. So, he had to wear it for a couple of years when it came to like maybe losing some money. The White Sox might have paid him, but the Yankees and Giants have made up for it and then some. Same thing with Giolito, like the 4-year and $50 million extension the White Sox reportedly offered was very fair in terms of dollars for a 4-year window, because looking at it last year, like you're looking at, 4.15 million, 7.5 million. So that sets up under this contract extension where they buy out his remaining arbitration years and 1 year free agency. They're basically looking at like a $13 million arbitration year for year 3, and then a $25 million contract for his first year of free agency. And right now he's, a little bit behind that. He's going to make $22 million instead of like 25, which that contract might have paid him for. And now, to make up that deal, like he would have to make $28 million in his first year of free agency. And that looks unlikely at this point. I think we can say that just, he's not going to get that AAV anywhere. But, we talked about it with, Giolito and Jose Barrios signing that 7-year, $131 million extension. As he was getting close to free agency with the Blue Jays, the Twins didn't want to give him that money. They traded him to Toronto. Toronto paid him. And I think that's kind of the future right now of extensions, especially once a pitcher hits arbitration. I think once he hits arbitration, you're talking about 6-7 years. You're talking about 7 figures, which the White Sox don't want to do. The White Sox really don't like going beyond 4 years with any pitcher, which is why they end up getting guys like Lance Lynn, which is why they end up paying closers and relievers premium money versus paying a starter premium money. They just do not like going above and beyond that duration for a contract, which makes sense in terms of rationality and pitcher health and everything like that. But these contracts are always irrational to some degree when you're going after a guy, and you just have to want it, have to make it work, and have to have some faith that you can work around it if it doesn't go well. So ultimately, the White Sox are not going to be able to extend them just because of their history. Like, I'd be very surprised. John Dinks did get 5 years. That didn't go so well. They did trade for James Shields in the remaining 2.5 years of his deal. That didn't go well. But I mean, like, that's the kind of deal they look for. Like the 2.5 years of a contract that doesn't look so bad. Shields got bad in a hurry. But like Lance Lynn was another one, getting the last year of his deal, signing the extension afterwards. Like, that's kind of what they look for when it comes to starting pitching. And otherwise, they hope they can develop guys and get the most out of their first 6-7 years, which is not a terrible strategy. But it's something I've been paying attention to. Just, the Chris Sale, Jose Quintana, Tim Anderson deals, Adam Eaton deals, those are gone, basically. And now it's these more expensive ones that are superstar insurance. And even then, when it comes to some pitchers, they might not want to do it.
The idea that I just thought of, like if Rick Hahn wanted to keep Dylan Cease, and he still believed that this contention window will exceed the 2023 season, which, don't laugh, podcast listeners. Maybe they do believe that, and they do believe that Pedro Grifol will help right the ship with the new coaching staff to get this team back in line. I'm wondering if the only type of extension idea that Scott Boras would even pitch to Dylan Cease, Jim, would be something like 3 years, $60 million, where you take care of the next 2 years, $11 million, $21 million, and then you sign Cease, I should say, in his first year free agency for like $28 million. Because then you're doing Scott Boras a favor, because if Dylan Cease continues to pitch at this level, then he's already got a baseline of $28 million going to free agency, and you could hold on to Cease for one more year. I don't know how realistic that is. Scott Boras has negotiated contract extensions. The most famous case is Steven Strasburg with the Washington Nationals.
That's the one I was thinking of.
Not going great, but the Nationals had to pay premium. They had to pay a premium rate. I mean, they had to pay the market rate to keep Steven Strasburg. 7 years, $245 million. Garrett Cole beat him overall as far as total numbers, but the AAV is quite similar between Cole and Strasburg, and that might be the same message as well from Boras to the White Sox front office. If they have the appetite, if they wanted to keep Dylan Cease long term, that it would have to be one of these big contracts that we've seen for like 6-7 years. And as you just mentioned, I already know the White Sox don't have the appetite for that type of contract, no matter how good Dylan Cease is. So I'm wondering if there's some type of middle ground that could be struck to keep Dylan Cease longer than the 2025 season, maybe keep him for the 2026 season. But as I discuss this more and just think aloud here, I don't even know what kind of team the White Sox will be in 2026. So I don't even know if they have the appetite for it. But Dylan Cease is going to make a lot of money based on the conversation.
Yeah, Steven Strasburg, actually, he originally signed a 7-year, $175 million extension with the Nationals, and then he opted out for the bigger deal. Like, he opted out midway through and then was able to sign an even bigger contract. So
got it.
That's kind of the first contract I had in mind. And, might have a similar opt-out to where, like, Cease can really make, even, like, Garrett Cole grade money. That's kind of what I'm thinking for Cease, would be along those lines of the original Strasburg extension, not the second one. Because, the first one was okay. Second one, not so much.
When did he sign the first one?
That was in...
Did Strasburg even get to arbitration?
I'm looking at right now, because in 2016.
So maybe they avoided arbitration.
Yeah, May 2016.
Okay. Interesting. Well, I mean, that could be a possibility, but again, the White Sox, Jerry Reinsdorf just doesn't have the appetite for that type of contract, so... Wishful thinking, but with the arbitration salaries, it's just something that came to mind. Just, wow, how much more money is Dylan Cease going to make the next 2 years? And looking at Max Fried and how much he's seen his increases over the seasons and getting to be the second place in the National League Cy Young last year compared to where Dylan Cease is now in arbitration 1. Yeah, I think $11 million next year is realistic, which would beat what Lucas Giolito is making in his final year. In the final year in team control, I wouldn't be surprised if Dylan Cease exceeds $20 million in an arbitration salary. So he is not going to be cheap much longer for the Chicago White Sox. Now, someone that is cost effective, I never want to say a player is cheap, but cost effective here is Jose Ruiz. And with the unfortunate news, Jim, that Liam Hendriks and his cancer diagnosis, we still don't know as far as his status. To start the year, we will not know his status of how long and how much of the 2023 season Liam Hendriks is going to miss until we get closer to opening day in late March. For those that are trying to mock up of what a projected bullpen is going to be, with Jose Ruiz only making $925,000 for the 2023 season, I'm assuming it's safe to pencil in Jose Ruiz right now at a projected bullpen.
Yeah, I think it's always been safe. Like Ruiz has always been this. I think his talent has been not being the biggest problem in the bullpen at any one point. He was always like, kind of in the bottom 3, but there's always somebody who's either a little bit worse or has options remaining, and he's never like a crisis. He always turns into a crisis whenever the White Sox try to get like anything beyond medium leverage out of him. Anytime like they've tried to get a hold out of him in the 8th inning or an extra inning save, it's been kind of messy and the Peter principle rears its head. But as a low leverage guy, a guy who helps like get games over with, like he's always been pretty reliable. So, and he's always healthy. Like he's pretty much always in the mix and ready to pitch whenever needed. So, he's been able to survive, and I would imagine him like continuing that just because other guys can be shuffled in and out. I think it's kind of a bigger impact for Nick Avila as they look to, with the Rule 5 pick, trying to figure out, whether he can, stay on the roster for any meaningful amount of time, how much of a project they want to keep in the bullpen. Like that's, to me, like it elevates Ruiz up a notch and then, makes Nick Avila more of an opening day possibility if it turns out like he might be Ruiz-ish in terms of utility. But yeah, I think the pressure now is on Ruiz with Hendricks out. Like everybody gets bumped up one notch and he'll be held to a higher standard, I think, to where like he might have to pick up an occasional somewhat tight situation and help out, especially if, Joe Kelly and Kendall Graveman have their availability issues with either missing chunks of time or back-to-back days like Graveman had. So, it's now that he's not like, I guess he's not making $1 million. We heard from Evan Marshall about like, the significance of making $1 million for the first time in your career, and he's not there yet. So even then, like, it's an amount of money the White Sox can more or less shrug at, pretty close to league minimum. But, with Hendricks gone and everybody being bumped up one notch on the leverage ladder, I think, he'll be under a little bit more scrutiny than in years past.
So after the arbitration salaries and the official signing of Andrew Benintendi and Mike Clevenger, when I do my mock-up for a 26-man roster, adding in Billy Hamilton and Victor Reyes right now as part of the bench for the Chicago White Sox, I've got the White Sox at $179.97 million. And the significance of that is that I know James Fegan of The Athletic when the offseason began, and many were quoting the number $180 million was supposedly the White Sox budget for a projected 26-man roster for the 2023 season. And with my math, which could be way off, with just the conversation we've had earlier in the show, I'm thinking they're right there right now at that type of payroll for a 26-man roster. Different number than the collective bargaining tax number. That's the number that means the most to ownership across Major League Baseball, the CBT number. That would be obviously a lot higher when you include the signing bonus for Andrew Benintendi, taxes, insurance, benefits, etc. They get added on to that total. But if you're looking at a 26-man projected roster and you're looking at that type of payroll budget, I've got the White Sox right at $180 million, Jim.
Yeah, after factoring in AJ Pollock's buyout to that number, then yeah, that gets around that neighborhood. And that is disappointing. Like when it comes to, where the White Sox are, the rebuild, or not the rebuild, I should say, but this contention window is now in, I think it's fair to say, critical condition, not stable, and it kind of should be throwing more money at the problem, because if it doesn't go well, or if it turns out to be more money poorly spent, money starts coming off the books next year, and then especially after 2025 flying off the books. So if the White Sox want to reallocate some funds and wait out some contracts and try to build a new roster around another, whether it's Colson Montgomery and Oscar Colas or other players, like there are other ways to do it. So it is, I think poor planning to take a step back after record payroll. I think it should be at this stage 2 record payrolls in a row before giving up. But as we're going to talk about, and this can be a great segue after the break, the White Sox do seem like they're putting more resources into other parts of the organization to try to make the most out of the money they're already spending. So at least there's that.
Yeah, we're going to be talking about that next after we take a quick break for a word from our sponsors. But the Chicago White Sox add another member to their front office to help the offense. Welcome back to the Sox Machine podcast. All right, I promise no more financial numbers from me for the rest of the episode. I have put myself temporarily on suspension from doing really terrible math in this episode. But let's talk about the new front office member the White Sox hired as they hire Sam Mondry-Cohen to their staff. And if you don't know Sam Mondry-Cohen, there is a good feature that I included the link into the podcast page on soxmachine.com, in which the New York Times, during the Washington Nationals run to the World Series in 2019, they did a feature story about Mondry-Cohen. And he started his career with the Washington Nationals working as a ball boy and just kept being really involved and building relationships within the Washington Nationals. And they discovered that they have some kind of wonder kid on their hands. And he became one of the first analytics employees for the Washington Nationals. He built their analytics platform, which they call Pentagon, very fitting for a Washington, D.C. based team. And thanks to Mondry-Cohen's efforts, he won a World Series ring in 2019. And his platform, the Pentagon platform, is focused on receiving feedback from the National Scouts, which at the time when Mondry-Cohen was an employee there, the Nationals had quite a few scouts. And he would get their feedback before implementing new metrics into the dashboard, because he wanted to reassure that all levels of the organization, the players, the coaches, the scouts, were comfortable with the data that he was presenting and avoid any type of information overload. And thanks to the reporting to James Fegan of The Athletic, it sounds like Mondry-Cohen, his task is to work with the Chicago White Sox hitters. And as you mentioned before the break, Jim, so essentially the White Sox have like 3 hitting coaches, and now they're adding Sam Mondry-Cohen to their front office staff, and he is going to be traveling with the Chicago White Sox all season. He is going to be embedded with the ball club for every single game during the regular season. We'll probably see him during spring training camp, which is just a month away, down in Glendale, Arizona. The White Sox are throwing a lot of resources internally as far as support staff and trying to help their hitters hit better this season.
Which is good. It's the kind of thing where you can dwell on it a little bit and say like, well, it would have been great if they did this 2 years ago. If they hired like a Pedro Grifol type 2 years ago, not so much Grifol himself, but maybe like somebody who just was as enthusiastic about certain, I guess AJ Hinch would fit under this, but just like, certain, personnel, being with a team that maybe, the manager does not know or wasn't a player, but is, they're very conversant and good at working with players and gaining the players' trust and respect versus like what they've done, like kind of half measures. We talked about like, Jose Abreu, buying iPads for people and Larry Garcia going off YouTube, and they did have Shelley Duncan in that role, I guess nominally, but it's hard to know like what kind of impact he had because on one hand, Tony La Russa had a very top-down administration. He was very much the overwhelming presence, whether it was because of just his name recognition or the way he actually ran things. But we didn't really hear too much about, we heard from Ethan Katz, heard from Frank Menachino, but otherwise it's very much La Russa. When it came to his decisions, his questionable decisions, like bench coaches really didn't figure in. We didn't hear much about Jerry Narin or from Miguel Cairo until Cairo took over later in the year. So if we didn't hear from them at all, it makes sense that we wouldn't hear about Shelley Duncan either, just because he's even lower down the chain. But it also seems like, Duncan was a, if Duncan wasn't like just a nepotistic hire, like, oh, I can't get Dave Duncan, so I'm going to hire his kid, which could very well be the case, just a Duncan program, or Duncan Jobs program. I think it's a case where it might've been a case where like Duncan was by player standards analytically inclined and knew how to work his way around, Fangraphs numbers and Baseball Savant and everything, just, the general numbers and had an interest in that, showed an acumen, kind of like Brian Bannister was kind of like I think maybe the first player known for, getting into that data himself. But I think that player is a little bit outmoded now. And I think there's either, players who really get into it or like really go, have really made a name for themselves, and Bannister has continued that. Like he got a head start on everybody else and continues to be that kind of guy. But otherwise, you see more of these, hitting experts, you guys have their own hitting lab, might've been like low minor leagues players and, couldn't get to even like double or triple A, but really figured out how to help guys with their swings and really use video and biomechanical sensors and everything like that to really understand what makes a swing tick. And I think the guy, Duncan, who's a ball player, could speak analytics, and that's all he does. If that's the kind of guy he actually was, isn't enough now. So I think, it's good that the White Sox have hired Mondry-Cohen to be in that role. And James Fegan had a story about Rod Larson doing the same thing on the pitcher side. Like Everett Tiford was the player equivalent of a major league player who was conversant in that stuff and continued to be understand how pitch mixes work. And he's a couple steps above like a Duncan type who would just be conversant in the basic analytics of sequences and pitch data and pitch effectiveness, that sort of thing. Now having people who were not players, but are able to be involved in the clubhouse and deliver data directly to players and having the leeway and the blessing of the coaching staff to do so is huge. And if it is, a transformational to certain hitters, whether it's like, Eloy Jimenez finally breaking through, Yohan Moncada getting out of his rut and succeeding, or, Lucas Giolitio getting back on track, like all these, this embrace of analytics and these guys who are, non-players getting really involved in everything. Like if they're able to take the next step or take the step that was missing last year, then great, better late than never. But if it becomes a case where like Moncada figures it out, but Jimenez doesn't, or vice versa, or Andrew Vaughn unlocks something, but other guys can't stay healthy, it really does feel like it's going to be like they really could have used the 2 years that they no longer have to get this all together. So time is of the essence, and it's great that the White Sox, if they can't get the payroll to get to $200 million or whatever to really spend what they should have been spending, at least they're doing something else besides crossing their fingers. Like there is actual, I would say, some ingenuity, and maybe you might consider other teams' ingenuity because the White Sox aren't the first team to hire these guys, but at least they're following the playbook, acquiring promising free agents on that front, to where that, like, if they can't, sign a 7-year deal for a guy, well, maybe they can sign like the equivalent baseball ops person just to try to help get the most out of the guys that they, are already counting on.
It does make me wonder, as you mentioned, La Russa, the top-down leadership, his observational analytics, which we made fun of constantly in his 2 years as managing the White Sox.
Mm-hmm.
I do wonder if it set the White Sox hitters back when it comes to just approaching analytics. There wasn't a great jump-off point to begin with, but whatever progress during the rebuild that Rick Hahn in the front office was trying to implement into the organization, I wonder if that just washed away when La Russa showed up and he tried to go with an old-school approach. And now here you have Pedro Grifol, who is trying to blend the two, but Grifol is the one that led the charge for the Kansas City Royals to embrace data, especially from an aspect of in-game decision-making. Pedro Grifol has been on record saying that he is expecting his players to have a baseline understanding of analytic knowledge, and I'm wondering just how many of the White Sox current position players would pass Grifol's test of if they know enough about analytics to help improve their play on the field, or to be able to identify weaknesses they may have in their game and address those weaknesses when it comes to spring training camp that starts in a month. And now you add the 3 hitting coaches, and now you add Sam Mondry-Cohen. The players themselves may be running out of excuses here, Jim, because unlike with Frank Menachino, and he had an assistant hitting coach, and Tony La Russa in the mix, it's new faces, it's new ideas, And there is more support staff than we've ever seen before from the Chicago White Sox. And it's bringing in outside ideas we have not seen part of the Chicago White Sox organization. And I know that I've been very critical of Rick Hahn, but this is the type of move that we've been waiting for Rick Hahn to make, as we have learned from the other franchises in Major League Baseball and what they do to tick, what they do to be successful on the field, especially in player development. I view the hiring of Mondry-Cohen as a positive. I know he didn't get the best results in Cincinnati, but I think the hire of Jeff Head could help with the White Sox, especially interpret the data and be able to point out red flags in player performance if they are noticing something with throwing speed, especially with position players, and with sprint speed as well, to be able to early identify possible injuries in players to give them a game off before they suddenly pull a hamstring and now they're on the injured list. Like, I like the direction the White Sox are going here. And as I mentioned, if this doesn't work in 2023, well, the support staff is there. Now are the players just not good enough? And that's a depressing topic.
Yeah. Well, one of the things I was thinking of when you're talking about, just the buy-in it's going to require from hitters and whether they're going to be able to do that is, in some cases, in some clubhouses, you could see like a little bit of a potential mutiny or potential for it. Just, I'm thinking of like Jace Tingler in San Diego, or AJ Hinch, his first stint in Arizona, where he had some ideas, but he also didn't have like the strongest personality. Players saw the manager as like maybe an extension of the front office, maybe too much of an extension of the front office. Like, what kind of autonomy do you have if you're spitting these numbers at us, that sort of thing? Like, and you're not like, reading the room. You hope that Grifal's reputation as a communicator would trump that, but just, there are some elements here of like a case where, like, new guy who has never played in the majors coming in and trying to set new rules and overhaul the system. I think, in Grifal's favor, the White Sox were terrible last year relative to expectations. Like, they didn't have the worst record, 500, et cetera, but like, they were bad. The offense was bad. The offense did not work. The lineup did not work. The lineup didn't play together all that often. So, Liam Hendriks talked about how the White Sox need like an authoritarian figure in the dugout. And, that's not Grifal style, but just like it is a regime change. And maybe if it's not, you're not going from like a dictator or something, but you are going to like a new way of doing things, a new mode, a new model. And that's going to be, like in Grifal's favor. Like, if it doesn't work, there will now be 2 years of bad performances, as an offense in the whole, maybe 3 years when we're talking about certain players. And now it becomes, the onus is on the player. Some players can be, moved off the roster. Some players can be waited out, but like, yeah, it's going to be a case where like there is more in Grifal's corner than there might usually be for a rookie manager taking over a veteranish team who has never played in the majors before. And now that they have 2.5 hitting coaches, like it does look like the front office does have the back of the instruction. And like, if we can't get through these guys, we're going to have to find new guys to get through. And that's what it strikes me as, that Grifal is going to have a lot of leeway unless like, and I don't know what it'd take, given we just saw the decision-making of La Russa, not just on the field, but just like playing guys who were obviously hurt. Like, the standards for decision-making on all sorts of fronts are very low for Grifal to improve, which I think is a little bit of a danger for the White Sox. Like, they have to make sure they're getting like a good manager and not just a manager who's better than what La Russa showed in his second year. But it's going to be a really new dynamic here. And I guess the good news is we've seen on the pitching side, certain pitchers, and I think most pitchers have embraced it. We've seen guys, overhaul their mechanics, guys overhaul their pitch mix, and really embrace it. Ethan Katz, I think, is a dork about it in a good way. Like, he really, he made his name on really getting involved in, helping pitchers improve their stuff, core velocity belts before that became known. And all that, now common knowledge was not common when Ethan Katz was making his name. They had Rod Larson, who, as we mentioned, is the, Sam Mondry-Cohen template on the pitching side. Everett Tiford was the player, ambassador beforehand. So like the pitching side has been ahead of this for a couple of years now, like I would say 2 to 3 years. Whereas like the White Sox, Shelley Duncan was not enough. I think if Menachino was trying to get like his data cues from Shelley Duncan, and Menachino was not like data averse, he just wanted somebody else to do it for him. Like the White Sox did not have enough guys to do it for him. And if Menachino was rejecting data, then kind of good riddance on that front. And there won't be much of a future for him in the game, but hopefully the pitching side will provide like enough of a showcase for what works for helping guys get better, to where like hitters will, if they're saying like, who's this guy? Who's this, dork, for lack of a better word, like, telling us what to do, and just, hopefully they can say, well, the dorks on our side have helped out a lot, and that'll kind of ease the way for any kind of tension, if there is any. But as you mentioned, with the performances they're coming off of and the amount of guys who have to improve, hopefully they're open-minded enough to take cues from anybody that the White Sox are sending to them to help them get better.
Well, Tim Anderson has already gone to the Driveline lab. I mean, he already posted that video of him getting modeled, getting scanned, taking swings in the cage. We don't know the full details of what his game plan is working with Driveline, but Tim Anderson's already one example of the Chicago White Sox going to the nerds, going to the dorks, looking for ways to improve. So hopefully everybody else has the same type of mindset, even though Anderson went outside the organization, of being open to this new coaching staff and being open to a new face in Sam Mondry-Cohen, who's had success with this platform. He's got a World Series ring recently, and we knew that Washington Nationals team could hit as they upset the Houston Astros that season back in 2019. So I'm really fascinated to see and how this new support staff works and what kind of immediate impact they bring to the White Sox offense. And we're going to get a lot more of those stories as, again, spring training is going to start in a month. And I think the early stories out of camp that everyone's going to write, Jim, especially from the beat reporters that head down to Glendale, Arizona, is what's the difference between Pedro Grifol and Tony La Russa? And we may get more insight in a month on just how things actually operated.
Yeah.
With La Russa in the clubhouse, not getting these tidbits that would have been very helpful in our conversations the last couple of years. Now the truth will actually come out with La Russa not around.
Yeah, everything about, like, basically so far, it seems, every bit of praise they've heaped upon, whether it's Pedro Grifol, the new hitting coaches, now with Sam Mondry-Cohen, like, has been like a passive-aggressive roast of the previous administration. Like, we're going to prepare players pregame. We're not in it to hit singles. We're not going, like, just everything's like, so what was it before is the next question. And like, that's what it was before. So yeah, it's kind of what I'm thinking. And you mentioned like the Pentagon database. And I remember that the Astros is ground control. So I'm wondering, like, would the Chicago equivalent be like the Manhattan Project for, the nuclear fission tests under the football stadium at University of Chicago, or I think it was Pile 1 was the name of the reactor there. So like maybe Pile 1 would be the name of the database in order to make it geographically relevant, but also kind of, have ties to advanced science and with some potential, militaristic uses.
I like it. I wasn't thinking of like, what would the White Sox name their new analytics database if they are building one with Sam Mondry-Cohen, but that would be some good suggestions for all of you history nerds and buffs. And what recommendations would you make in the White Sox naming their new data platform if Sam Mondry-Cohen starts building one? I do like the reference to the Manhattan Project, Jim. I do like that one.
Yeah, it's like, I think Fermilab's still going. Otherwise, you could call it that.
Yeah, true. Very true. But I hope you enjoyed our conversation, as that will do it for this episode of the Sox Machine podcast. Thank you guys so much for listening to this episode. If you just discovered the Sox Machine podcast, you can subscribe to the show wherever you listen to podcasts, such as Spotify and Apple Music. You can follow us on Twitter. We're at Sox Machine. You can follow me on Twitter at SoxMachine_Josh. We do post the episodes to our YouTube page, which you can subscribe to our YouTube channel at youtube.com/SoxMachine. Last I looked, we're at 950 subscribers to the channel. We're just 50 subscribers away from our milestone at 1,000. So if you could do us a favor, if you do enjoy watching videos on YouTube, please help us and subscribe to our YouTube channel at youtube.com/SoxMachine. If you enjoy our work and you would like more, you can sign up at patreon.com/SoxMachine, where we have several different tiers of support, including our new tier, the Veterans Committee, which you get to serve as our de facto bounce board, where you get direct access to Jim and I as far as in a group chat and Patreon exclusive events that we'll be hosting, as we're going to be curling in a couple of months as well. We may do a little meetup as well for those that are heading to Cincinnati for the road trip in early May. And we do have monthly plans that start at $2 as our Patreon supporters. They get exclusive content, ad-free versions of both the podcast and website. And we have new Sox Machine swag. They're the first ones to receive it. You can also sign up for an annual subscription at patreon.com/SoxMachine. The Sox Machine podcast is a production of SoxMachine.com, your home for all the things Chicago White Sox baseball, and part of the Blue Wire Podcast Network. Alongside Jim Margulis, I'm Josh Nelson. Thanks for listening and watching.